In the Caribbean, the largest US naval buildup in decades is currently underway. Warships, stealth aircraft, and strategic bombers have been deployed off the coast of Venezuela. In response, Caracas has mobilized troops, activated air defenses, and called upon millions of militia volunteers to defend the homeland. In this video, we're going to look at what has led to this situation, what is currently happening, and what it might mean for the near future. But before we start, I just wanted to say thank you for all the support, and I really appreciate it. So firstly, a bit of background to the tensions. 2 decades ago, Venezuela was a wealthy nation, bolstered by oil revenue, and its president, Hugo Chavez, aimed to challenge US influence in the region. Chavez formed alliances with countries opposed to the US, particularly Russia and Iran. In 2008, Russian bombers and warships arrived in Venezuela, sending a symbolic message that Moscow could project its power to America's backyard. Venezuela purchased billions of dollars worth of Russian arms, while Iran assisted in building drones and defense systems designed to deter US intervention. This bold strategy set Venezuela firmly against Washington, a confrontation that intensified following Chavez's death in 2013. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a collapsing economy and increasing civil unrest. In response to a violent crackdown on protests in 2014, the US imposed sanctions. Then, in 2015, the Obama administration declared Venezuela as a national security threat, which legally allowed for broader pressure against the country. But the turning point came in 2018, with a highly contested election that was internationally condemned. When Maduro claimed victory, the US and its allies refused to recognize him, asserting that he had undermined democracy in the country. From that moment, the conflict shifted from diplomatic tensions to a genuine struggle over who would govern Venezuela. In early 2019, opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself as the interim president of Venezuela after calling Maduro's inauguration illegitimate. It quickly gained the recognition of the United States and many other Western nations. While Russia, China, and other allies backed Maduro, Washington quickly responded by imposing oil sanctions that cut off nearly all of revenue from Venezuela's most vital industry. As a result, inflation skyrocketed and shortages became widespread. Millions of people fled the country, leading to one of the largest peacetime migrations in history. Despite this, President Nicolas Maduro managed to retain power by consolidating support among loyal military elites, receiving assistance from Cuban intelligence, and securing the backing from Russia, China, and Iran. The Trump administration in its first term explored various forms of covert action, including a failed mercenary incursion known as Operation Gideon in 2020, which was quickly crushed by Venezuelan forces. For Maduro's supporters, this served as evidence of US conspiracy efforts. For Washington, it reinforced the regime's resilience. By the time the Biden administration took office in 2021, Guaido's movement had stalled. The US adapted its strategy, offering partial sanctions relief in exchange for democratic concessions. In 2023, a fragile agreement was reached that allowed for monitored presidential vote in 2024. However, when promising opposition candidates were banned from the elections and the results were withheld, the US reinstated sanctions. Once again, diplomacy gave way to confrontation. In January 2025, Donald Trump returned to the White House. This time, the approach was significantly more aggressive. Washington now claims that Venezuela is not only authoritarian, but also a hub of narco-terrorism. Under this pretext, the US began a major military deployment in mid-2025 that included missile destroyers entering the Caribbean waters, the activation of stealth fighters and surveillance assets at air bases in Puerto Rico, and the deployment of special operations and intelligence units to join the mission. In early September, the first US strikes targeting boats suspected of carrying drugs resulted in dozens of casualties. The US offered little public evidence to support its actions, angering international observers. Venezuela responded, flying fighter jets close to US ships and mobilized militias and put its air defenses on high alert. Then came the most dramatic escalation, the US deployment of a US aircraft carrier strike group, which includes more than 70 warplanes and thousands of sailors to the region. While Washington insists that this is part of counter-narcotics enforcement, the scale of the deployment suggests something different, as it includes strategic bombers capable of deep strike, amphibious marines that are preparing to land in hostile shores, and the public authorization of covert CIA operations within Venezuela. The situation appears less like policing drug routes and more like the preparations for regime change. Carcaris frames the crisis as a struggle for sovereignty, claiming that it is a US attempt to seize oil and install a sympathetic leader. President Maduro has called on the United Nations to condemn the strikes against Venezuela. In response to the situation, Venezuela has dispersed its military forces to fortified coastal positions and warned that it will resist any invasion. However, Venezuela is not alone in this conflict. Russia has offered its full support, condemned the US actions, and may send additional advisors and air defense supplies to Venezuela. China is blocking US initiatives at the United Nations and continues to purchase Venezuelan oil, which keeps the Venezuelan economy afloat. Iran is heavily involved in the drone production and military cooperation with the country, posing a growing asymmetric threat to US forces. Regionally, even governments that are critical of Maduro oppose to US military intervention because Latin America doesn't want a war in its neighborhood. In Caracas, officials argue that they face the greatest existential threat in a century. They insist that they do not seek war, but are prepared to fight if necessary. Oil appears to be at the center of this crisis. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, making it an attractive strategic target. For the US, ousting Maduro could weaken the influence of Russia and China in the region, lower global oil prices, and allow US companies to return to Venezuelan oil fields. For Maduro, oil revenues generated through secret deals and sanctions evasion are critical for maintaining military loyalty and keeping the state operational. If US forces were to blockade the country, it could lead to rapid collapse of the regime. However, this action would also risk triggering a regional energy crisis and escalating a tense situation into open conflict. Oil, in this case, serves as both a weapon and a potential catalyst for war. So what? Right now, both forces are in a tense standoff. A single miscalculation could change the course of history. The most likely course of action that I see is that the US continues to impose significant political pressure on Caracas, while using covert action and intelligence sources to try and influence regime change within the country. This will likely be coupled with continued strikes against drug traffickers to justify their presence in the region, possibly using this as a region to impose a naval and air blockade as the situation drags on. While it is unlikely to achieve regime change in the near term, it will continue to put pressure on Maduro, which could lead to him making a very favourable deal with Trump. The most dangerous course of action that I see is that the US continues to ramp the pressure up, conducting limited strikes within the country under the guise of their anti-drug operation. This would likely cause international condemnation, especially from China, Russia, Iran and their supporters. Additionally, it is currently unclear what would be gained from this type of operation, outside of showing Maduro that the US can do it whenever they want. And a wildcard course of action could be that the US does conduct an invasion, which would be a massive step up, one that would have ripples around the globe. While this is highly unlikely, it would shake up the security landscape in the Americas and show the international community that Trump is not to be crossed. However, it would also likely lead to political isolation of the US, as this type of operation is wholly unjustified at this stage, regardless of what Trump says. All in all, this situation is far from over and may just be beginning. The US is moving strategic resources into the region at great cost, and it is highly unlikely that they're just doing this for fun. For decades, Venezuela and the United States have clashed over ideology, power, and control of resources. However, the current military pressure is unprecedented, and the stakes have reached global level. Whether the situation will lead to negotiation or conflict may depend on the decisions made in Washington and Caracas in the coming days and weeks. One thing is certain: the future of the region is being shaped right now on the waters of the Caribbean Sea, and the world is watching. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts down below. This has been HM Intelligence, and we'll see you next time. See you!